Firstly, thank you so much to Danielle McPhail of the Environmental Protection Authority for this example. This is something that she's very familiar with and talked us through it, and I found it incredibly helpful in terms of understanding how EIA works in practice in Tasmania. So this is a scenario where a proponent applied for permission to quarry limestone in Maydena. I'll show you where that is in a minute. The development application that was submitted to the Derwent Valley Council was referred to the EPA under Section 25 of the Act. It was a limestone quarry in Maydena, and it was for 30,000 cubic metres per annum of extraction and processing. So that amount is important, and we'll come back to that. And you can have a look in Schedule 2 of EMPCA to see why 30,000 is important, because the guide in EMPCA is for a referral for anything over 5,000. So yes, the council were correct to refer the application because it's a fair-sized quarry. This is where it is. For those of you who are not familiar with Maydena, it's a beautiful part of Tasmania that's just on the edge of that Wilderness World Heritage Area, really the gateway to the southwest. Probably an hour and a half, hour and a bit from Hobart. And this here is the proposed mining lease. This is the boundary of the area. So you can see that the city of Maydena, or the town of Maydena, is here. Importantly, there was somebody living here, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And you can see from subsequent slides how it works out with land tenure. So this is the zoning. There's industrial opposite, and rural resource is the zone of the proposed lease. So the zone and the proposed use match up, which is the first thumbs up. You can see here again the lease. So this is important to the way that the proposal was presented. You can see here the different years, block 1, block 2, block 3. So because this ended up being quite a sensitive site, and because quarries sometimes operate over decades, it is quite a tricky proposition for the EPA to approve something that might run for 30, 40, 50 years. So a staged approach is one way to tackle this, where block 1 is given permission to go ahead in the initial stage. That's monitored, and presuming that everything's sort of responding as expected and within the acceptable permit conditions, then block 2 can be developed, and so on. So this shows the different parcels of land, and you can see that some of them are private and some of them are Forestry Tasmania, some Crown land. This, I think, is owned by Nurskaskoog in the pulp and paper mill in New Norfolk. So there's quite a few landowners here, including residences, who need to be taken into account when thinking about impacts of this proposed project. So the second step, after having looked at the map, which is in itself incredibly informative, then we need to think about the class of assessment. So this is where you need to go to Schedule 5 of EMPCA. If you type this into Google, it'll pop up. Legislation is just amazing in terms of being an online resource now, so much easier than it used to be. So we have a look at that to figure out what the class of assessment should be. And basically the guidelines depend on how big it is. So if it's just a relatively small project, or it's a project in an area that's already been substantially impacted, then you might just need an environmental effects report. So this is something that's desktop based. It's not requiring a site visit or any kind of detailed investigation. whereas a development proposal that includes an environmental management plan is where you get into the EIA proper. It's a site-specific study and it requires detailed information. It's a lot more expensive than just doing an environmental effects report. There needs to be consideration of the key risks. So what is it about the proposal that's going to interact with the environment in a way that might risk some of the natural values, some of the landscape values? And that might help determine the site-specific studies that the EPA requires. So this is all spelled out in the Act. You can have a look through, but it's probably just better to stick with this example for now. And as you become more familiar with doing an environmental impact assessment, the legislation stops being a dry document and becomes a useful guide. The other thing to think about at this point is what other information might be needed. And this is where the assessor's role is interesting, in that they need to apply common sense and they need to think carefully about the interaction between the development and the particulars of the landscape. So the same 30,000 cubic metre quarry in one environment is going to be quite different to another environment. So it's, while there's guidelines that are spelled out, we rely on assessors doing a good job in terms of actually making this happen in practice. And then there needs to be a case for the assessment, a preparation, and it needs to meet the expectation of the stakeholders. So let's just think about 4 different audiences for a minute. So there's the consultant, and remember the consultant is hired by the proponent to actually do the work. So the consultant is a professional, and while it's tempting to think about them just in terms of their employment by the proponent, ultimately they do need to be the consummate professional, do a good job, and because they might be held accountable. So if things proposals end up in the RMPAT, the Resource Management Planning Appeals Tribunal, the consultant is really standing on their own there. The consultant's duty is to the tribunal, and as an expert witness, they're cross-examined for their professional advice. The proponent probably thinks that this is a bit of a pain in the neck, and they'd be right in thinking that, it might end up costing a lot of money. So the proponent doesn't want this to become any bigger than it needs to and any more costly or time-consuming than it needs to. The EPA board want to know that the assessor who is in their employment, who's a public servant, is doing a good job and is giving them good advice so that they can make a decision about the permit or being given permission to do this, and if they are given permission, what the conditions might be. And then, of course, there's us, the public. We expect that this is done in an open, transparent way that's underpinned by good information. We expect the consultant to be professional, to not omit things that need to be included, to do a good job. We expect the proponent to pay for things, because why should the taxpayer stump up money for somebody's idea? And we expect the board to be independent and to make a professional judgment. So this is tricky. Obviously, there's all of these different stakeholders with different, slightly conflicting and sometimes expectations. Okay, so this is key because this shows the limestone landscape. So limestone is karst or like a cave system. It's readily soluble, and so the pattern of water movement through this landscape and the resulting cave systems and karst features are a really important natural value. So this is the output, or one of the outputs, of the professional advice about significant karst potential. And there is somebody within the state government who is good at this, as well as consultants who consult to developers to come up with this kind of information. And you might see here why there's a 3-block approach, because the significant karst potential is down in this area. And so you can see that the southernmost part of this block is where there's significant potential for harm. And up here in this area that's being proposed to be developed first, while there is potential and there's sinkholes confirmed and stream sinks confirmed, it's not quite as significant as the known cave sites and other features in the area to the south. So this was really key in push and was a big unknown before the project started. Interestingly enough, the expectation that there might be significant vegetation on the site was not there. So a consultant did a thorough report and found no threatened species, threatened flora on the site, and no threatened vegetation communities. So this is pretty common wet eucalypt forest and woodland, and it's I mean, while all natural areas have inherent value, this isn't something that was flagged as triggering legislation with respect to anything that was listed. Fauna. So here are the records from the Natural Values Atlas, and you can see that while there are some records on site, they're not anything that was of particular value, pretty common things, and unlike flora, fauna move on and off the site. So this is native species sightings. There are no records of threatened fauna on the site. There is suitable habitat, but at the time there were no sightings, dens or nests on the site. And there were no threatened raptor nests like wedge-tailed eagle nests within 1 kilometre, so that was important. So then once all this information is in, then the council and EPA can start the next process where there's public consultation and agency consultation. So agency being people within the EPA who might provide expert advice. So who might put in a representation? Anyone can put in a representation. You don't have to be a neighbour. You can put in a representation even if you don't live in the state. Anybody can put in some comment about whether they support or don't support the project. And as it turned out, of the 15 representations, might have been a few more than that, it was less than 20, 11 of those were in favour, so gave it a tick, and the rest, which was a minority, were against the proposal, and that included a resident who was living nearby. The representations were mostly from landowners who wanted the limestone for their crops. So this is not something that kind of springs to mind when you think of EIA and people complaining. Environmental impact assessment and the process is also about people wanting to support the project. And in this case, the majority, who were landowners who wanted the resource and didn't want to have to get it from much further away, wanted the proposal to go ahead and spoke in favour of it. So the EPA might want to consult with other specialists, and I've already showed you a bit of information that would have come from specialists, and they might also ask people within government. There is a karst specialist within government, and they were consulted as part of this assessment. And then the board might decide that they want other additional information, and this is up to the assessor managing the project to figure out whether there's anything else missing. And so this is why this unit is important and this training is important, because we rely on all of those people who are part of the process to do a good job. And then there's the actual formal assessment by the person running the project who makes a recommendation to the board. So the actual assessor within the EPA, who's doing all of the hard work to keep this moving, doesn't make a decision. They make a recommendation and the board makes a decision. So what are the key issues based on all of this information? Well, it turned out to be karst. So although the initial impression was, well, this is a relatively undisturbed area in terms of fauna and flora, there are going to be problems, it actually turned out to be the underlying substrate that was of most concern. The issues raised by representations, there was a range of them. Some were relevant, some were not. So by relevant, it has to be things that can be considered under the planning scheme. So if it's not a planning issue and it's not relevant to the project, and this is where neighbourly disputes come up and sometimes make things complicated, they can't be taken into account. So there is common sense applied here, as well as the underpinning of the planning scheme and the guidelines issued by the EPA that dictate what can and can't be taken into account. There is consideration, thanks to expert input, of the likely impacts from the proposal, and in this case the karst is what was of concern. And these three words are important. Can the impact be avoided, mitigated or managed? So this is the question that is asked as part of environmental impact assessment, with avoiding impact being the most desirable situation, and why Block 1 was being developed in the north ahead of anything in the south to avoid impacting some of those more valuable karst sites. If you can't avoid, then how can you mitigate? It's very difficult in this case because you can't shift the karst around. It is there, the features are there. It's not like perhaps a threatened daisy that we know is relatively happy about being moved and actually quite likes disturbed sites, in which case maybe you can move or replant to mitigate, but maybe sometimes you have to manage the impact by, for example, creating offsets. So this is where, okay, you accept that that site is damaged, but there has to be some kind of equivalent asked of the proponent to make up for the damage caused. So an interesting matter came up with one of the people who opposed the project, because it turns out that they were occupying an industrial commercial site as a residence, and it wasn't legal. They weren't supposed to be there. The EPA and the council didn't know they were there. They put in representation, which they had every right to do, to say, I'm living nearby and I'm not happy about all of this noise and dust and whatnot that's going to be going on near my home. The legality of the residence did matter because they're not supposed to be there. It's not zoned for residential, and so the representation was accepted and considered, but ultimately it wasn't taken into account. So would you recommend approval? What do you think happened in the end? Yes, the permit was given, subject to conditions that the karst be managed carefully.